Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chairman of the Institute of International Monetary Research. This is my latest update on the international economic situation, particularly from a monetary perspective. I'm talking at the end of 2017, it's just after Christmas, December 2017, and obviously one of the key topics at the moment is the prospect for 2018, and I suppose to some extent the prospect for later years. What I want to do is to, in the next few minutes, to look at what's happened in the last few years in a longer term context of kind of last 30, 40 years. Then to come back more specifically what's going on in Britain at the moment, and then to make some remarks about the global prospect in 2018. Now, to read the newspapers, you might think that the world economy is very troubled at the moment, and indeed that there's been some deterioration in the underlying growth prospect. Larry Summers, one of America's most influential economists, said in a presentation to the International Monetary Fund 4 years ago that we faced what he called secular stagnation, long-term stagnation of output, rather as had been feared in the 1940s at the end of the Second World War. Well, let's just check whether this is true or not. And there's also just sort of a little worries about instability, too much debt, etc., etc. Here is a chart of the rate of growth of world output since 1980. I want you to notice at the very end that the actual growth rate is bang in line with the average of that 38-year period. And the growth rates for 6 years now have been very, very close to 3.5%. They've been kind of 3.3, 3.6, 3.4, 3.5. It has been an incredibly stable period. The newspapers keep on hyping up some sort of instability which just isn't there. And we need to remember that when looking ahead to 2018 and 2019. You might then also, is there any truth in this talk about a reduction in the trend rate of growth of world output and any risk of secular stagnation? Well, the 38 years splits up into two periods of 19 years. The growth rate of world output in the first 19 years was 3.1%, and the second of the 19 years, it was 3.8%. It was higher. And it was higher despite the Great Recession in the middle. The talk about secular stagnation is wrong. We live in a very dynamic world economy, and also a world economy that somehow or other, despite all these worries, has been very stable in recent years. I'll come back trying to understand why it's been stable in a few minutes, but I want now to talk about, just to understand where we are. We're not in some great troubled global situation. Right? I want now to understand some of this stability, to look at Britain, where I know a bit more about what's going on because I live here. And what I want to show, first of all, is a picture of the growth of two things: nominal GDP, money GDP, which includes the effect of rising prices, over a period a bit longer than the last one, it's at 1964 to today. Then also of real output in this period. You can see that back in the 1970s and 1980s, there were some years when nominal output went up by 25%. That wasn't because of rising output, that was because of inflation, which some years was more than 20%. The average growth rate of real output in that 1964 to 2016, 2017 period was 2.3%, with some periods of weakness, 4 recessions, and the Great Recession of 2008-2009 being the worst. But again, you can see the last few years been relatively stable, and before the Great Recession, again, there was a period of some stability. And in the last 20 years or so, nominal GDP has been more like, say, 5% a year on average, typically, with again this exception in 2008-2009. The question that arises is, why has there been this quite stable period, in a sense since the early 1990s, but then also again since the Great Recession? And in order to understand this, I think we need to start to remember about money. Now, I'm going to, just refer to my notes here, I want to yes, we can split up this period of, I'll go back to 1964 into the Great Inflation, okay, the 1970s, 1980s, 1960s was fairly stable, and then the first Great Moderation, Great Recession, and then a kind of another Great Moderation maybe starting today, which is important when we think about 2018 and 2019. Now, the next picture I'm going to show you is of the relationship between money and nominal GDP. But before I do that, I want to just make a very obvious logical point. When we're trying to understand movements in national income, we should use the same theory all the time. We should have the same theory for 1968 as we have for 1989, as we have for 2007, as we have for 2016, as we have, of course, when we're looking ahead. Right? We shouldn't jump around from one theory to another theory because that's not scientific. All right? We should be looking for patterns in evidence. Okay? Okay. Now what I've got here, it's really the crucial picture, shows you the change in the quantity of money alongside the changes in nominal GDP. The reason why the Great Inflation gave way to the Great Moderation, I would argue, is because the rate of growth of money fell substantially. It was much lower in the 1990s than it had been in the previous 20 years. And on the whole, it was more stable. We then had the Great Recession, which can be explained at least in part by a collapse in the rate of growth of the quantity of money. And then in Britain, as elsewhere, we've had in the last few years, last 6 or 7 years, a very stable period. It's had a kind of Great Moderation Mark II. And we've also had very clear stability of the rate of growth of the quantity of money. All right? I would say the stability of the last few years in Britain is to be explained mostly, not the only factor, but mostly by the stability in the rate of growth of the quantity of money. I have put a bit more work on all this. What I've done is to split up that period from 1964 to 2016 into 6-year periods. There are 9 of them, in fact. The first one is not quite 6 years, but there are 9 of them. And I've worked out what's called the standard deviation of the rate of growth of nominal GDP and the standard deviation of the rate of growth of the quantity of money, and then put together a chart where I look at these standard deviations. It's not a magnificent chart, but it's a pretty good chart. When you get volatility in the growth of money, you get volatility in the growth of nominal GDP. I put it to you there is a causal relationship here. It's a matter for debate, but I put it to you there is such a relationship. Okay, now think about 2018, 2019. The sort of story I've been presenting about the UK in recent years, of this rather stable growth of money, has applied elsewhere. It's applied in America, it's applied sort of in the Eurozone. I had a troubled period in the early 2010s, but then more stronger recently. Applied in Japan. In China, the growth of money has been lower than it was, say, in the 1980s and 1990s, but again, quite stable. Therefore, the prospect for 2018 and 2019 depends on the growth of the quantity of money, depends on policy decisions taken by central banks and governments, and also, of course, on the state of the banking systems. Now, my worry about next year is that there is going to be cutting back on quantitative easing in the Eurozone, less quantitative easing next year than this year, and that means probably some reduction in the rate of growth of the quantity of money. And in the USA as well, there is, at the moment, the Federal Reserve is selling off some of the assets acquired in the quantitative easing programs of the last decade or so. And that too, I think, will dampen down money growth. So the implied expectation for 2018 is actually for some weakening in the rate of growth of output in these two important parts of the world economy, which I think will dampen down growth relative to 2017. It's been quite a good year, in fact. I'm not expecting a recession. There's no need for a recession, but I am expecting 2018 to be a little bit slower than 2017, and perhaps that's no bad thing, because after all, we're seeing some tightness in the energy markets, oil prices are going up, and some tightening of monetary policy, some slowdown in money growth may be something that will head off inflationary worries for 2019. Thank you.